to basically lag the discussion by saying anything or anymore. So I welcome Professor Patnaik to take over the session and speak on the issue of going beyond neoliberal capitalism.
Okay. Yesterday I was talking about the crisis that gets generated under neoliberal capitalism. But let us forget about the crisis for the time being. Let's just look at the normal functioning of a neoliberal capitalism. Now that is characterized by certain obvious features. The first feature which I referred to is that the whims of globalized finance basically determine the level of activity in the economy. It's one of the crucial determinants of the level of activity in the economy. But of course, there is, as I said, an asymmetry that if finance suddenly leaves the country in large numbers, in that case you have a deflation come exchange rate depreciation, which actually squeezes the working class, because the exchange rate depreciation, a nominal exchange rate depreciation, becomes an effective exchange rate depreciation in a world in which the profit margins are not compressible downwards only through a lowering of the real wages, through a lowering of the real wages, through the fact that while prices rise, money wages don't catch up. So that is the normal situation. If on the other hand there's a lot of capital inflow, in that case there's a lot of financial inflow, then the financial inflow does not necessarily directly lead to an increase in the level of activity. It is held as reserves by the central bank. That of course eases the the state of credit, that eases the state of credit, but easing of the state of credit is something that does not necessarily directly lead to any significant increases in the level of activity, because the demand that is generated through such easing may actually leak out in considerable magnitudes abroad, because this easing of the state of credit improves the expenditure only of the better off segments of the population, and much of their expenditure has a high foreign exchange content, and therefore it leaks out. Let us, however, get on to the second point, which is important. The second point is that in a neoliberal economy where commodities, goods and services are free to flow across country borders, a country, if it is not competitive enough, would in fact experience an import surplus. And the import surplus gives rise, obviously, to deindustrialization of the economy and a recession, a lowering of the level of employment and a reduction in the level of activity. Now, the point is, this is something which is not recognized in any trade theory, whether you look at Ricardo or whether you look at Heckscher-Ohlin proposition, is not recognized, because all of them assume full employment. They assume full employment. They in fact believe that a capitalist economy is characterized by the maintenance of permanent full employment, which is obviously not the case. As I was saying in my first lecture, capitalism is essentially a demand-constrained system in which, if there is a compression of demand, then you find that there's a reduction in the level of activity and therefore larger unemployment. So if you have an import surplus, or if you have an increase in the size of the import surplus because of the fact that the economy gets opened up to a relatively free trade, then of course you can well end up having a reduction in the level of employment. Now, obviously, maybe some countries actually would end up with an increase in the level of employment because of this. But if you take the global south as a whole, there is no reason to believe that opening up the economy has given rise to an increase in employment. For instance, in India, it is certainly the case that the import surplus is a perennial feature of our economy, and we have had a trade deficit for decades now. All right, so that's the second point, namely that really the degree to which you're opening up to trade, freer trade, depends on the, I mean, it can impinge on the level of activity in a way which is not anticipated by the theory. The third point is that, that even assuming that we are not worried about the import surplus and we are not worried about capital flowing out of the country, suppose, in other words, the financial situation is such that the exchange rate can be maintained in a stable manner, and suppose it is the case that there is no import surplus, we manage to balance our trade. In that case, obviously, the rate of growth of the economy becomes dependent on the rate of growth of exports. That's why it becomes a case of export-led growth. And this is generally celebrated and praised as a very good thing, that export-led growth is something which is desirable. Now, export-led growth would be desirable, obviously, in a situation where exports are growing rapidly. If you have the world economy, export-led growth, exports, the rate of growth of exports would depend on two factors. First is the rate of growth of the world market. In a situation where the world market is stagnant, then your rate of growth of exports would also come down greatly. And the second thing it would depend is on the share of the world market that you can actually capture, the degree to which you can keep capturing a larger and larger share. Even in a stagnant world market, you may have a positive rate of growth of exports if your shares are increasing. And this is something which necessarily pits countries against one another, and something which gives rise to a kind of Darwinian competition among them to outdo the others. In fact, the whole essence of the neoliberal policy is that each country is actually trying to do down the other while talking about cooperation and so on. Fundamentally, it's an extraordinarily competitive environment in which countries are just trying to do down the other, because otherwise you yourself would go down. In other words, they are doing so because they are compelled to do so. This has very important philosophical implications that capitalism, okay, very briefly. You see, the remarkable thing is that capitalism is supposed to give you individual freedom. I mean, the whole argument of capitalism is that, look, socialism is authoritarian, while capitalism, you actually have individual freedom. As a matter of fact, every individual in a capitalist society is caught in this Darwinian competition, and as a result, necessarily is forced to a kind of, do things irrespective of whether you like it or not. In fact, Marx had said capital accumulation occurs not because the capitalist wants to, but if he did not, he would go down. Okay, because of which he even referred to the capitalist, who's supposed to be, as it were, a rich man, a hero of the entire system, as capital personified. The capitalist is just a personification of the tendencies of capital that work out through his actions. His actions are not what he necessarily wants to undertake. He may decide to go for a walk instead of thinking about capital accumulation, but if he does so, and nobody else in his kind of milieu thinks of capital accumulation, in that case he would simply be driven out of the business and have to join the reserve army of labor, the outside of the system, the reserve army of labor. So, and this is something which, of course, is now let loose as far as countries are concerned, because countries are now forced to compete against one another in order to do down the other, not because they're necessarily bad or want to do down, but that's what the system compels you to. Now, the third point I was trying to make is that in this, competition forces you to have a very high level of growth of productivity, of labor productivity. That competition forces you to continuously have process and product innovations, so that I mean, all these innovations are essentially labor saving, and therefore the continuous process and product innovation has the effect of raising the rate of growth of labor productivity. And everywhere you find that the rate of growth of labor productivity has really increased quite remarkably in the period of neoliberal capitalism. Now let's just see what his implications are, because the two logically interrelated phenomena follow from this. First is that, again, let us take an identity that employment times labor productivity is equal to output. By definition, because labor productivity is nothing else but output divided by employment required to generate or employed to generate that output. From this, the obvious formula follows that E dot upon E plus beta dot upon beta is equal to Y dot by Y, which means that the rate of growth of employment plus the rate of growth of labor productivity is the rate of growth of output. It's an obvious truism. All right, these are all kind of truisms, so there is nothing special about it. Now, if you have this, so it follows then that the rate of growth of employment is nothing else but the rate of growth of output minus the rate of growth of labor productivity. Now, if you have a situation in neoliberal capitalism where the rate of growth of labor productivity increases quite sharply, because now countries are competing against one another to kind of stay afloat. You find, for instance, that earlier the government of India had reservations for the handloom and powerloom sector. All that has to go, because now you'd find then kind of competition from other countries, cloths coming in. I mean, you can't prevent other countries from competing against you in a neoliberal environment. Therefore, you cannot have all these controls and all these restrictions in a neoliberal environment. All that basically means that labor productivity increases. The change in the composition of output, the change in the methods of production, they all combine to accelerate greatly the rate of growth of labor productivity. Okay? Because of which, even if the rate of growth of output increases in some economy under neoliberal capitalism, the rate of growth of labor productivity increases so sharply, and this is true of India, that this difference, which is the rate of growth of employment, may even fall short of the rate of growth of the labor force. Okay? And I'm calling it the rate of growth of labor force, let's just call it is less than L dot by L, the natural rate of growth of labor force. Now, in such a case, if the rate of growth of employment is less than the rate of growth of the labor force, that means the unutilized labor component, the labor reserves relative to the total available labor, increase proportionately. Okay? And that may show itself, as I said, in terms of a rise in the unemployment rate. But of course, because we have a system where you have the rationing of work in such a way that it's not as if some people are fully employed, some people are fully unemployed, but rather you have a situation where everybody is partly employed, partly unemployed, and therefore the rise in unemployment rate that would otherwise have occurred takes the form of each person having a reduced amount of workload, a reduced number of days in which the person finds work, okay, and correspondingly a reduced level of income. Now, therefore, Utsa must have talked to you in the morning about the estimates of poverty that she has got. Ask yourself the question: why are these? Why is poverty rising? Why should it rise in a neoliberal economy where the growth rate has increased? I mean, let's assume that. Let us assume, along with the government of India and against what people like Arvind Subramaniam are talking about, that the growth rate has increased. how is it that in an economy in which the growth rate has increased, you have an increase in absolute in the magnitude of relative poverty, that is, poverty-stricken population relative to total population? Even if you say that, okay, poverty is a complex matter, let's not go into it, there is no doubt about nutritional poverty. She would have given you the calorie consumption data. So the nutritional poverty, those who are afflicted by nutritional poverty, their relative proportion in population actually increased, which is a remarkable finding. And this is not true only of India. This is actually true of the world as a whole. And it is the case. Some people, when confronted with this, then argue that no, it is to do with the fact that people's preferences are changing and so on. I had a PhD student who actually took some 150 countries over 20 years. He had innumerable equations and so on the basis of which he got a very good fit to show that, as a matter of fact, the relationship between per capita food grain consumption and per capita real income is in fact an upward sloping relationship. It flattens out at high levels of income. In other words, not at the levels of income at which our population is. In other words, if you are becoming better off with a rise in real per capita real income, then you should be consuming more. If you are not consuming more, that obviously means that your real income is something which is not rising. And the reason it's not rising, again, in a situation of India and so on, is not very difficult to find, because you have privatization of essential services. It's not as if people want to educate their children more today than they did day before yesterday, but the fact that now education is so much more expensive because of the withdrawal of the state from providing education. Likewise, healthcare, the withdrawal of the state from providing healthcare. I'm not saying Kerala, but taking the country as a whole. I mean, there are horrendous stories about peasants who come from, farmers who come from Uttar Pradesh to Delhi. Their child is unwell, and so they enroll the child in some private hospital, and then they have money they have got only for about 18 days, but the child stays longer than 18 days, so they go back and sell the land in order to let the child stay for a longer period. At the end of it, the child dies, so that they have lost their land and lost their child. It's just horrendous. I mean, remarkably very tragic stories. So, all this basically means that okay. So the question I was saying is that, I mean, that's as it were the mode through which the increase in poverty works out. But why should poverty increase at all if it is the case that people are getting high levels of money income? But they are not getting high levels of money income precisely because of the fact that the employment growth is less than the rate of growth of the natural labor force. In such a case, labor reserves are increasing relative to the total labor force. In addition, we know from the lecture that we had, I had given some days ago, maybe yesterday, the day before, that as far as the peasantry is concerned, the withdrawal of support by the state to the petty production sector, including the peasant agriculture sector, basically implies that there is a reduction as far as their incomes are concerned. For instance, they become victims of world market price fluctuations, which was not the case earlier, because of which there is a lowering of income of the employed population, and additionally, there is a reduction in the magnitude of employment. Both these combine to make sure that there is not enough money income. And when you add to it the fact that the prices rise effectively because of the privatization of education and healthcare, then you can see why nutritional poverty may actually be increasing in terms of the people afflicted by it as a proportion of population rising. Now, when this happens, the other side is that obviously, but some people must be becoming better off. if it is the case that a large number of people are getting squeezed because peasant agriculture is getting squeezed, and because of the fact that labor reserves are rising, that means the employed population is getting squeezed and the proportion of unemployment is rising in the population. If for both these reasons people are actually becoming worse, a large number of people are becoming worse off, in that case, if output growth has actually increased, which is what I assumed, then it must be the case that some people are becoming extraordinarily well off, obviously. Now, that is what I referred to as a rise in the share of economic surplus. That basically some people, those who live off the surplus, that means output minus the incomes of the working people, working population, divided by output, that is the share of economic surplus, is something which rises as time passes in a neoliberal regime. Now, it is this increase in share which is responsible for the crisis that I'll be talking about now. But now, so far, I'm just talking about the normal working of a neoliberal economy. The figures that Utsa must have given you are figures comparing 1993-4 with, let us say, 2011-12. But 2011-12 is not when India faced the crisis. The crisis really impacted on the economy after that. So, even the normal working of the economy is associated with the phenomena that I'm talking about, namely a rise in the share of the economic surplus. And this is in the world output, because as I was talking about last time, even American wages get linked to the third world labor reserves. Since the third world labor reserves make sure that in the third world the wages are at a kind of more or less at a subsistence level, which is what Arthur Lewis had actually theorized about 70 years ago. And if the American wages get linked to the wages of the third world workers, they also don't rise. So if you look at the vector of real wages, the vector of real wages remains more or less unchanged, even as the vector of labor productivity is rising, which after all is the reason, which is the reason for all this happening. So if you have labor productivity rising and wages unchanged, real wages unchanged, then it follows that the share of the surplus is rising within countries and is rising at the world level. Now, if you have a rise in the share of economic surplus in output, then this has some implications, which is really, okay, the first implication, of course, is the rise in economic inequality, which people like Piketty have been talking about. Piketty's own explanation for the rise in income inequality is something which is wrong, but on the other hand, he and his team's statistical findings are absolutely of great value. So, the rise in income inequality is an obvious phenomenon. I mean, if you look at the share of the top 1% in total national income, the share of the top 1%, they estimate, I mean, this is a very standard procedure among income distribution economists. Namely that they make certain assumptions based on tax revenue, income tax revenue, and on the basis that they make the estimates. Income tax was introduced in India in 1922. Now, compared to 1922, the level which the share of the top 1% has reached today, which is roughly about 24%, 23.56 or 7, is higher than at any time in the last 100 years. And this is something which newspapers were talking about a few days ago, that even though the British Raj had seen Maharajas and it had seen these Sahibs and so on, having extraordinarily high levels of living compared to the ordinary poor person, nonetheless, the share of the top 1%, and this is of course estimated, you can quarrel with it, but the share of the top 1% by Piketty's and his team's estimate today is greater than at any time since the income tax was introduced, which was in 1922, so over the last 100 years. But the other interesting thing about Piketty's finding is that the share of the top 1% in national income had actually gone down. It had gone down after independence with a great deal of effort by the state to about 6%, which was the minimum in 1982. This minimum level was reached in 1982. After that, it has increased, and today, as I said, it's about 23.6%. So roughly, let us say 24%. So 6% share of the top 1% being 6% again was the lowest that you had had since income tax had been introduced, the previous 60 years. So the post-independence state, we may be critical of it for various reasons, but cannot be accused. The entire economic strategy which was followed during the dirigist period cannot be accused of having generated increased income inequality. If anything, it actually reduced income inequalities, if these estimates are to be taken seriously, which I suppose in the absence of anything else we should. Then the post-independence dirigist regimes had this much to their credit, that they brought down income inequalities very, very sharply. But at the same time, since the introduction of neoliberalism, income inequalities have increased really quite dramatically. Many people trace the introduction of neoliberalism to the mid-1980s, but whatever, roughly speaking, from that period, income inequalities have increased, and now the top 1% has about, as I said, 23.6% of the total national income, and reportedly about 40% of the total wealth of the country. This is something which I shall come to in a little while. Who had asked me about, what is the solution I would suggest? You had asked. All right, okay. So I'll come to it today. All right. So that is the first implication of this phenomenon which I'm talking about. Rise in the share of economic surplus in the total output, which, as I said, is nothing else but B beta minus W divided by beta. Is the second implication with which I am particularly concerned. That implication is that when you look at the national income identity, let us say Y is equal to okay, this is an identity. I'm taking consumption to be just a certain average consumption propensity multiplied by the income itself. Okay, investment, for reasons we have discussed in the past, in any single period can be taken to be given because it's a result of investment decisions taken earlier, and this is really investment expenditure. This investment expenditure is going to add to capital stock at the beginning of the next period. Am I making myself clear? Investment decisions taken in the current period give rise to investment expenditure in the next period, and they give rise to additions to capital stock at the beginning or at the end of the next period, which is beginning of the third period. G is nothing else but, let us say, a small, there is a fiscal deficit here, times Y. Okay, so government expenditure, and let me just assume that the taxes paid, whether you are a wage earner or a surplus earner, as a proportion of their income is roughly the same. Now, of course, this is a very because the poor people pay huge taxes, but in the form of indirect taxes. As a matter of fact, the only study available on this is for the year 1973-74, there was a study which was made by an official committee about the different income groups, how much of their income they paid in the form of taxes. Okay. Now this, of course, direct taxes they don't pay because the income tax has an exemption limit. But this required a lot of very tricky calculation because they pay indirect taxes. And therefore, how much indirect taxes a person pays is not very easy to find out because of the fact that, you know, you don't pay indirect taxes only on one commodity. At least those days, you paid indirect taxes on the inputs that went into the final good. You paid indirect taxes on the final good, so you paid indirect taxes at various levels. So you were required to invert an input-output table in order to find out how much tax someone paid. And what, on the basis of that, they actually found that the bulk of the government's tax revenue came from populations. I think 55% of the government's indirect tax revenue came from populations which those days had an expenditure of less than 100 rupees per month. Now, expenditure of less than 100 rupees per month now would be, let us say, an expenditure of less than 1500 rupees per month, which is really extremely poor people. They were way below income tax limit, but the total indirect taxes collected from them was 55% of the total tax, of the total indirect taxes. And they paid 55% of the total indirect taxes. So indirect taxes impinge heavily as far as the population is concerned, the poor population is concerned, and it follows that that taxes are paid by everybody. And I'm just assuming that while the consumption propensity is a weighted average of the various income groups, the tax rate is uniform, that the amount of tax they pay is simply one uniform fraction of their income. Okay, that's why I put it TY. And of course, we know the deficit is maximum 3% for center, 3% for state. So altogether, T plus dy is your level of government expenditure. You can't rise above that. You may, but if you do that, in that case, it's an exception, then you have to make rectification and so on and so forth. Now, in such a case, this C is really a weighted average of the consumption propensities of the working people and the consumption propensities of the surplus earners. In other words, of the wage and working income earners and of the surplus earners. The consumption propensities of the surplus earners is necessarily lower than the consumption propensities of the wage earners. Okay? Therefore, any increase in income distribution that raises the share of the surplus earners would lower the consumption propensity of the country as a whole, which basically means that this would go down. When this goes down, this is more or less given. This, by my assumption, is more or less given. I'll discuss it in a moment. And as far as this is concerned, is of course, in a sense, outside our hands, how much exports are made and so on. I'll come to in a moment. So other things remaining the same, a fall in the level of C would give rise, a fall in this weighted average C would give rise to a fall in Y. Now this is basically the ex-ante overproduction I was talking about. Why do I say ex-ante? Because this is a tendency. I said other things remaining the same. You can actually make sure that other things don't remain the same so that the actual observed income doesn't fall. But the tendency for this income distribution shift in favor of the surplus earners is to make sure that there is a tendency for the income to fall, and that's an ex-ante tendency, whether it gets realized or not. Now, obviously, such an ex-ante tendency before the Keynesian interventions became acceptable under capitalism, such an ex-ante tendency normally gave rise to attempts to change X minus M. And it gave rise to such attempts by competitive devaluations, competitive exchange rate depreciations among the various countries. The gold standard was an arrangement where the exchange rates were fixed. Okay, every exchange rate was fixed in terms of gold, and therefore gold being common, every exchange rate was fixed vis-a-vis other countries' exchange rates. When the Great Depression happened, then people tried to rescue their economies by getting into an exchange rate depreciation. They abandoned the gold standard, that's how the gold standard collapsed, and they entered into exchange rate depreciations. Mind you, since everybody was doing so, they didn't nobody gained much out of it, but nonetheless, that is referred to as a beggar my neighbor policy. You must have come across it. That I try to export my unemployment to other countries as a means of resolving my unemployment problem. And therefore, I make my neighbor into a beggar in order to make sure that I stay afloat. So, beggar my neighbor policy is one which was pursued in 1931 by all, I mean, all the large countries. They devalued their currencies, but obviously today that is not the case. That you can't just kind of, you cannot consciously depreciate the currency because in some sense it's determined by the market. But what is more, even if it is the case that you somehow engineer the depreciation of the currency. By the way, there are various ingenious ways in which, let's say, the Indian government manages to depreciate its currency. I mean, it will get the State Bank of India to suddenly start selling in the foreign exchange market and so on, selling, or buying dollars in the foreign exchange market in order to raise the price of dollars and so on. So because we have nationalized banking system, the government resorts to all kinds of ways to muck about or to manipulate the exchange rate. But even so, this can be done only within certain limits because after all, you cannot. And if all countries did it, then of course nobody would benefit from it. So X minus M is hardly going to be an offsetting phenomenon to this tendency, this ex-ante overproduction tendency. Investment in any period, as I said, is given and you can't really do much about it. Government expenditure is the one where Keynes had suggested, of course, you could do something about it. And what had Keynes suggested? He had suggested that you can enlarge the fiscal deficit. Or the obvious way is to enlarge the fiscal deficit. The alternative way is to actually tax the rich heavily. I'll come to that alternative way in a moment. But this enlarging the fiscal deficit, I would like to take up because there's a complete lack of understanding about the fiscal deficit, the obfuscation in the standard literature. The standard literature says what? That fiscal deficit is a bad thing. Why is it a bad thing? What is the standard argument? Because we know we have fiscal responsibility legislation fixing the ceiling on the fiscal deficit. Why do we do that? In other words, why is fiscal deficit supposed to be a bad thing? Crowds out. Okay. Now, in 1929, there was, okay, before I go to 1929, let's just see. Let's just assume for simplicity, in the current context, a closed economy, in order not to have to sort of, talk too much about. Or you can assume that x is equal to m, or you can assume that x minus m remains constant, and we are talking in terms of deltas and so on. Okay, so the argument in any closed economy, investment, of course, has to be equal to savings. It's an identity. Now, one of the things that arose out of the whole Keynesian revolution was to say that the causation in this identity was from the left to the right. That basically investment generates an amount of savings equal to itself. Okay. Now, suppose we think, how does investment generate an amount of savings equal to itself in any economy? If the economy is demand constrained, has lots of unutilized capacity, unemployed workers and so on, then investment or any change in investment would generate an amount of savings equal to itself by enlarging demand and therefore output, therefore the level of activity. Am I making myself clear? Now that is called output adjustment. So in a demand constrained system, investment generates an amount of savings equal to itself through output adjustment. But of course, if you are operating at full capacity or if you are operating at full employment, then investment also generates an amount of saving equal to itself, but not through output adjustment. How does it do so? It does so by what you have apparently been hearing, through a profit inflation. That basically it adjusts prices relative to money wages. So that's called price adjustment. So if you have an increase in investment, suppose I equal to S to start with, and suddenly I increases. If I increases, S must increase. How does S increase? Because there's excess demand in the economy, prices rise relative to money wages, because of which profit margins rise. There's a shift of income distribution from workers to the capitalists. We know that the capitalists save a larger proportion of their profits than the workers. It follows, therefore, that there is a rise in the level of savings, even out of a given level of full employment output. So, in a situation of demand constraint, investment generates an amount of savings equal to itself through output adjustment. In a situation of supply constraint, investment generates an amount of savings equal to itself, or if you like, a change in investment generates an amount of savings equal to itself through price adjustment relative to money wages, through profit inflation. All right. Now, if this is the case, then let us see. Let me break up this I into IG, that is investment of the government, and investment of the private sector. Similarly, let me break up this into SG and SP, savings of the government and savings of the private sector. So IG minus SG must be exactly equal to SP minus IP. Okay. Now this is called the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit, which is normally defined in terms of the excess of government expenditure of government revenue, you can actually think of it as, if government expenditure consists of current consumption and investment, government revenue minus current consumption is government savings. So fiscal deficit is nothing else but IG minus SG. Okay. So it follows from the fact that investment generates an amount of savings equal to itself, that a fiscal deficit generates an excess of private savings over private investment exactly equal to itself in a closed economy. Am I making myself clear? It's an identity, and once we have accepted that the causation is from the left to the right, which it is, I mean, there's not a question are agreeing or disagreeing with it, in that case it follows that a fiscal deficit generates an equivalent amount of private excess savings over private investment. So a fiscal deficit in that sense finances itself, because automatically it creates in private hands an amount of excess savings which it then borrows. Okay. Kaleski gives a very beautiful example, that imagine that the government finances the fiscal deficit by borrowing from banks. Okay? Then at the end of the period, what the government does, since it has generated an equivalent amount of excess private savings, the government floats bonds, takes over these excess private savings and returns to the bank. So that at the end of the period, if you take the period as a whole, government borrowing has increased vis-a-vis the private sector, not vis-a-vis the bank or the central bank or any such thing. And the remarkable thing, it's a beautiful thing to imagine that the savings which the government borrows from the private sector are savings which have been placed in private sector's hands by the government itself. Not in any conspiratorial corruption. There's functioning of the system. Through the functioning of the system. So the point is that, that the SP minus IP, let's assume that IP is constant, again, as we have been doing. So IP is constant. In the period we are talking about, it follows therefore that a fiscal deficit puts in private hands the excess savings which the government borrows. The fiscal deficit in that sense finances itself. You don't have to have any prior savings. On the contrary, the savings which finance the fiscal deficit in private hands are generated by the fiscal deficit itself. Yes, please. I'm not saying government savings, private savings. SP. You see, let us for a moment, for simplicity, assume that there is no SG. So I'm assuming a closed economy, I'm assuming government doesn't save. Okay? Okay? I hope that would make it clearer. Then the entire government investment is a fiscal deficit. Yes, please. Yeah. Everything. I mean, there's absolutely no problem about it. If the central bank is printing new money, in that case, again, the government would be generating an amount of savings in private hands, excess savings equal to the fiscal deficit. But the only difference that arises, it's a difference that we don't go into in discussing all this normally, is that the private wealth holders may not be interested in holding government bonds. Okay. The Kaleskian simple example where the government borrowed 100 rupees from the banks, let us say it borrows 100 rupees from the central bank. Okay. Then 100 rupees accrue to the private sector in the form of excess savings. When the government can float bonds, pick up that excess and return to the central bank, in which case there is no increase in money supply, no increase in anything. But the private wealth holders may not wish to hold only government bonds. They may wish to hold, now that their wealth has increased by 100, they may wish to hold some money. If they wish to hold some money, in that case, suppose out of the 100 they wish to hold 20 money and hold government bonds worth 80, then the government would be able to raise 80, return to the central bank, 20 would be increase in the government's indebted to the central bank, and 20 will therefore be the rise in the level of reserve money. Okay? And the same is true. But that depends on private portfolio choice. By the way, the whole of pre-Keynesian economics, and also which is true of contemporary economics, is based on the assumption that money is not held as a form of wealth. That the only demand for money is a transaction demand for money. Okay. Attempts have been made to incorporate a wealth demand for money, but all those attempts have logical errors and so on. But fundamentally, the pre-Keynesian theory works best if the only demand for money is a transaction demand for money. Yes, please.
So what is the ideal rate of fiscal deficit? Do we need FRBM?
No, hang on. From this, it does not follow that a fiscal deficit crowds out anything. But from this, it does not follow that a fiscal deficit is a good thing. I want you to ask yourself the question, then what is wrong with a fiscal deficit? I'll come to that before, but let me tell you the story first. The story is the following, that in 1929, when there was, you see, in Britain during the Great Depression, the level of unemployment was about 20 million. But by 1929, Britain was one of those countries that got into the depression earlier. About 10 million people were unemployed, during which time the Liberal Party leader who had been the Prime Minister of Britain during the First World War, Lloyd George. Lloyd George was a Liberal Party leader, I think on Keynes's suggestion, was a member of the Liberal Party. Lloyd George proposed that given 10 million unemployed, it will be a good idea if we start some employment works to employ these people and finance that by having a fiscal deficit. Okay. To that, the argument which was given by the government, the British Treasury, is that no, it's going to crowd out private investment. And the argument was as follows, that suppose the idea was that suppose there is a given pool of savings in the economy, which is given by this. Okay? Now, the interest rate is here, the level of investment is here. The theory was that the interest rate is determined by it equilibrates investment with savings. Okay? The saving curves is a kind of straight line upwards. Investment curve is a kind of downward sloping relative to interest rate, which is something that Keynes also took over and so on. There's no much dispute about this. It's another thing that you may not agree with it. I don't agree with it. I don't think it's a very good way of presenting the investment function, but let's just take it. So the idea was that suppose the government increases the fiscal deficit by, or runs a fiscal deficit of 100, in which case this curve shifts laterally outwards by 100 at every point, because those 100 are the public works, are the employment fellows, who are being given employment. Okay, so the argument was the interest rate would rise to this level, and because of which private investment would have actually fallen to this level. Okay, originally it was here. Now private investment would have fallen to this level. It follows, therefore, the fall in private investment is exactly equal to the rise in the fiscal, to the rise in government investment. And that is called complete crowding out, that really the fiscal deficit entirely crowds out private investment. Now, in a situation in which the savings curve is not really a vertical straight line, but let us say is an upward sloping line. In that case, the rise in the interest rate would also bring about somewhat larger savings, private savings, in which case you would not have complete crowding out, you would have only a partial crowding out. But no matter whether it's complete or partial, there is a crowding out. Okay. Now, what is wrong with this? What is wrong with this theory? The whole of the Keynesian revolution was to show that this is wrong. Why? What is wrong with this theory? Let us, or let's go back in order to see what's wrong with it, back to the stark case of now savings, even if let us assume they depend upon interest rate. When interest rate rises, more savings come about, though that is not being assumed here. But savings also depend on the level of income. Okay. Now, when you draw a curve like that, you are assuming a given level of income. Therefore, you are assuming, in fact, a full employment income. So you are criticizing a suggestion to improve employment by assuming that there is no unemployment. Am I making myself clear? You see, it's on the base. It is for this reason that the multiplier was developed, and Kahn's argument was, which later on, is that in fact, if you have a fiscal deficit, then this curve would shift. So that at any given interest rate, you generate an amount of income. At any given interest rate, you generate an amount of income which is such that the savings out of it would be equal to the fiscal deficit. I mean, you know, because private investment is given, therefore private savings would rise, and exactly as I was saying, SP minus IP would rise. Okay, so any suggestion that a fiscal deficit crowds out private investment is completely wrong. But then that doesn't mean the fiscal deficit is a good thing. What is wrong then with the fiscal deficit? What is wrong with a fiscal deficit is that, you see, as I said, it puts an amount of savings in private hands exactly equal to itself, which it then borrows. The private sector has done nothing. It simply sits at home, watches television, and you find that your savings are going up. Okay. Why do they go up? Because your profits are going up, your business, you know, if it's an output adjustment, your business is enlarging. Otherwise, you're getting higher prices given the same level of money, wages, therefore higher profits, and higher profits means higher undistributed profits, higher savings, and so on. So, it is now savings are additions to wealth. So it is actually exacerbating wealth inequality. So any government expenditure financed by a fiscal deficit is wealth inegalitarian relative to the same expenditure financed by an equivalent tax increase. Okay. So that is why a fiscal deficit is not a good thing, but is not a good thing not for reasons which are normally suggested about crowding out or this or that, but a fiscal deficit is not a good thing because if you can have tax-financed government expenditures, then tax-financed government expenditure is much more egalitarian than a deficit-financed government expenditure. Okay. Now, okay. But of course, now under the whatever, you know, under the FRBM, we can't raise the fiscal deficit, so let's just keep that aside. Now, by the way, this has very, very important philosophical and other implications. Keynes thought that the objection of finance capital to a fiscal deficit is simply because they don't understand the theory. You see, he attributed it to a lack of understanding. He actually thought that once his theory got understood, then objection to fiscal deficit would disappear. But that is not the case. Obviously, we know. You know, if that is not the case, then raises the question: why does finance object to a fiscal deficit, which I think is very fundamental. I think it's a very fundamental question of political economy. I mean, I have my own views on it, but I wouldn't like to inflict them on you. Anyway, let's just proceed. So, one way in which you can overcome this ex-ante overproduction problem is by having larger government expenditure. Larger government expenditure may be financed by a fiscal deficit. Alternatively, I would prefer the larger government expenditure to be financed through taxes on the rich. Now, suppose you have larger government expenditure being financed through taxes on the poor. In that case, since the poor more or less consume the bulk of their incomes, in fact, Piketty's estimate, by the way, shows something quite interesting. It shows that in France, which is an advanced capitalist country, 50% of the population owns virtually no wealth. It owns only 5% of the nation's wealth. Now that shows that obviously they more or less consume whatever they earn. So, and that's true of 50% of the population. So, it follows that taxing the working people, the non-surplus earners, in order to raise government expenditure would hardly add, quite apart from whether you like it or not, would hardly even add to the level of aggregate demand, because their consumption would go down. If you impose a tax on them of 100 rupees, their consumption would go down by more or less the 100 rupees. And if the government uses the proceeds in order to increase its expenditures, government demand goes up by 100 rupees, but there is no net increase in demand, because 100 rupees fall workers' consumption, 100 rupees rise in government expenditure, no net increase in government demand. In aggregate demand. There would be a net increase in aggregate demand only if the tax is imposed on the rich who have a certain saving propensity. All of you who are familiar with the jargon would know that in such a case the balanced budget multiplier would be greater than 0. Okay, that 100 rupees you take from the rich, their consumption may go down by 50 because 50 would come out of their savings. When the government spends 100 rupees, then there's a net increase in aggregate demand of 50 rupees. Okay, but this is precisely what would be objected to in a neoliberal regime, because as I said, in a neoliberal regime, countries are competing against one another. As I said, a kind of Darwinian competition in order to attract capital to locate plants in their own countries, to locate activities in their own countries. And for that reason, they are actually giving tax concessions. But on the other hand, if you actually have a situation where you are taxing the rich, basically you are taxing the capitalists. One way of taxing the rich is by taxing companies. In that case, you would find that this is something which under a neoliberal regime would mean a substantial outflow. So a substantial refusal to locate plants in your country, to locate activities in your country, and what is more, a substantial outflow of finance, because finance would start getting worried that the leftists are taking over. Okay, so you would have an outflow of finance, and that being the case, the country would get into a very serious crisis. To avoid, so any way, as long therefore as you remain within a neoliberal order, there is very little, you cannot pursue a Keynesian policy of improving the level of activity. If there is a crisis, then there is very little that you can do to overcome the crisis. There is a proposal which has been mooted from time to time. It was mooted during the Great Depression also, that okay, this is true of one country. What happens if a large number of countries, particularly let's say a large number of rich countries, get together and pursue a fiscal deficit, jointly, or enlarge government expenditure, even if it's pursued by, even if it's financed by a fiscal deficit, or even if it's financed by taxes on the corporates. In that case, capital is not going to fly away from the advanced countries in any substantial measure to the third world countries, because after all, the advanced countries are the home of capital, the home base of capital. Why not do that? And this is something which was mooted during the Great Depression by Keynes himself and by a group of German trade unions, who basically said that there should be a coordinated fiscal stimulus given to get the world economy out of this Great Depression. But the point is, it was not really pursued, or it was not very seriously discussed. This time around, there is even less serious discussion on it. So a coordinated fiscal stimulus is out of the question. And what is more, I am a bit worried that any talk about a coordinated fiscal stimulus today would be, let us say, a fiscal stimulus among the advanced countries. It would leave out the third world countries. And what is more, in case the coordinated fiscal stimulus gives rise to a larger level of activities, you would find that this itself would raise the prices of primary commodities, might actually create inflationary pressures as far as advanced country economies are concerned, to prevent which they would be, as it were, stimulating their own economies and keeping down the economies of the third world to make sure there are no inflationary pressures. I'm a bit worried about that, if at all it gets taken seriously. But in the absence of this, the world economy is more or less stuck in a crisis. Some people are calling it secular stagnation and so on. People have, of course, different explanations for it, but the fact that now we are in a situation which can be described as one of a secular stagnation is something which is not in debate or not in dispute. Then what can one do about it? There are two alternative things one can think about it. Obviously, I think a solution to it within neoliberalism is something which is out of the question. I mean, I think this is something which even things like the London Economist and so on, who are very smart, smart mouthpieces or mouthpieces of the smarter elements of international finance capital are beginning to recognize and editorialize. People talk about now we have got a Keynes-Roosevelt moment when we have to reflate, when you stimulate the economy and so on. Okay, so but I believe that, I mean, and this is something which I'm asserting that within the neoliberal order there is no way out of it. And this, as I argued on the first day, I believe the worldwide upsurge of fascism is really a reflection of this particular phenomenon. But then what would be two alternative ways of going beyond neoliberalism? One strategy which many people would suggest is that, let us say, a coordinated movement across the world by working people, workers, peasants and so on, in order to have a regime change, an economic regime change, a political regime change that will bring about an economic regime change. But that, to my mind, would mean waiting forever. Meanwhile, people's conditions are becoming worse off. Already I mentioned, and also was giving figures about the increase in nutritional poverty. This increase has become really much sharper in the period since 2011-12, even before the pandemic. So, the alternative that I would suggest is for a large country or a group of small countries getting together, forming a union to delink themselves from this phenomenon of neoliberal globalization by having capital controls, by having controls on financial flows, by having trade controls. Now, if you do all that, in that case, of course, you are not going to have relocation of activities to your particular country or your particular region. You're not going to be able to finance a trade deficit because until now, as I've mentioned, countries like India were getting huge amounts of financial inflows. You can't do that anymore, in which case your trade deficit cannot be maintained. If you can't maintain the trade deficit and your ability to attract capital from all over the world is also reduced, productive capital is reduced, in that case you have to revive public investment, you have to revive trade controls, you have to revive controls on capital flows, all of which go against the logic of neoliberalism. All of which basically would then, first of all, restore agency to the nation state. See, because as I was saying, the nation state has lost agency because of neoliberalism that traps the country in global financial flows. Okay, So the nation state must become autonomous once more. It must become something which reflects the demands and wills and aspirations of the people rather than the demands of international globally mobile finance capital. So the restoration of agency to the nation state is an extremely important prerequisite, and that is something which is also a necessary component of democracy. People vote a government. People vote a government within a nation. If that government does not have agency, because the nation state that it stands for doesn't have agency, in that case people's votes are really of very little consequence. So that's a subversion of democracy. But if you are therefore going to have a restoration of democracy, agency to the nation state must be restored. And of course, then the financial government expenditure financed by taxing the rich would then have to entail a transfer towards the poor sections, towards the working people. Now here I would like to suggest to you, sorry I'm taking a bit longer, but last lecture. So I would like to suggest to you to think about one thing. That you see, whenever we talk about welfare expenditure, we think of welfare expenditure as something the government gives to the poor. Now, it has three fundamental problems with it. The first problem is that it is seen as government's charity. In fact, I've come across leaders saying that, look, people didn't vote for us, but we did so much for them. In other words, the fact that we do things for people, welfare expenditure is always seen as a largesse on the part of the government towards the people, which I think is fundamentally anti-democratic. The second problem with the welfare expenditures is that, if the fiscal situation is tight, you just cut down on them. Okay. I mean, like the government of India is cutting down on MGNREGS. You don't like the MGNREGS, you just cut it down. You cut it down even when the fiscal situation does not necessarily demand its cutting down. So it becomes dependent upon the whims of the government itself. Okay. And the third thing is that it is everything said and done, it's on a scale which is really nothing to write home about. Okay. I would personally suggest that we rethink this entire thing and that we actually think in terms of introducing into the Indian Constitution a set of fundamental economic rights, just as we have fundamental political rights. Now, these fundamental economic rights would have to be a right to food, a right to employment, failing which the person must be given a full wage by the state, a right to free quality education, a right to free quality health care through a national health service, and of course a right to non-contributory pensions and disability benefits. Okay. If you have these rights, we made some calculations which show that, we calculated the right to free quality education only up to the higher secondary level. Okay, we did not think in terms of free education above that. I mean, I'm sure it should be, but we just haven't made the calculations. If so, and for right to food, we assumed that food was distributed to the population exactly on the same terms as the BPL population used to get before the pandemic. Okay. Now, if you do all that, then in addition to what is being spent on these under various heads, you would require about 10% of GDP to be additional government expenditure. Now, you don't have to spend all the you don't have to raise all the 10% of the GDP, because as you spend, some of it accrues to the government as taxes through the multiplier. Therefore, in order to spend 10% of GDP as additional government expenditure over and above what you are spending on all these heads, you need to raise about 7% of GDP as additional revenue. And this, we found, could be raised by just imposing two taxes on the top 1% of the population. One is a 2% wealth tax. Okay, 2% of the wealth of the top 1% of the population is one source of additional revenue, and the other is a 1/3 inheritance tax also imposed on the top 1% of the population. Okay, these two together would give you enough resources to actually institute constitutionally mandated, not just at your whim, a welfare state in India that actually provides all these to the entire population. I just like you to think about it as a possibility, and that's where I'd like to stop. Thank you.
Sir,
Yeah.
you stopped short of explaining your views on the why private capital, I mean financial capital doesn't like fiscal deficit.
I know, that's okay. Yeah, yeah. No, I thought that people would find it, very bored. Okay, why does, let me put it this way, that Kaleski had said that finance capital does not like a fiscal deficit because of the fact that it, that it undermines the legitimacy of capital, and particularly the legitimacy of that segment of capital which Keynes had called functionless investors. I mean, finance capital is a functionless thing because, after all, you're not running any enterprises. You're simply moving your funds around from one enterprise to another depending on whatever gives you greater speculative gains. Keynes had called financiers functionless investors. Okay. Now, any government expenditure which revives activity, okay, not government expenditure that revives activity by providing incentives to capitalists, but any government expenditure that directly generates larger employment or revives activity by spending more, which generates larger employment, is something which delegitimizes capitalism. Okay, and it certainly delegitimizes the functionless investor segment of capitalism, which is finance capital. Okay, so that is the.
Government borrowing also limits the possibility of the private.
No.
No?
That's exactly what I was arguing. Yeah. Government borrowing does not limit the possibility.
But the fiscal deficit has a tendency to depreciate the currency.
Just a minute. Fiscal deficit has a tendency to depreciate the currency. You're absolutely right, because of the fact that finance capital doesn't like it and leave the country. Okay. Now the point is that there is no objective reason why a fiscal deficit should depreciate the currency. In a country where you had capital controls, there is no reason why a fiscal deficit. In fact, for much of my life, when I was a student, school, college, and so on, we used to have large fiscal deficits. The currency didn't get depreciated. So the point is that a fiscal deficit would certainly depreciate the currency within the context of a neoliberal economy. But on the other hand, that is not something which is actually, intrinsic to the logical functioning of a capitalist economy. By the way, this I was telling you about fiscal deficit is basically something which Joan Robinson had called the humbug of finance. That finance actually keeps spreading this humbug that a fiscal deficit crowds out private investment. Okay, you have a look at her book, Economic Philosophy, and she discusses it.
But
finally when the currency depreciates, the returns for the capital or the finance will be low. So they don't
Currency would not depreciate except in a world in which finance is free to, because see, finance is free to move around. In that case, okay, that's the same as saying that if you had a left-wing government in India, the currency would depreciate. Of course it would. Of course it would. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a left-wing government in India. Okay? In other words, that is getting trapped within the problematic of a neoliberal economy itself, which we have to break out of. But what I'm saying is actually true, because in 2004, when there was a left-supported government led by Manmohan Singh, I think Sitaram Yechuri made some statement. He just said something to the press one day that we'll have a common minimum program which is going to be pro-people or whatever. And the stock market fell. And everybody, the newspapers, so nasty, they actually said Sitaram Yechuri has cost the Indian investors so many billion rupees. So you see, you have to.
Then the de-linking process you are talking about, you have to de-link from the whole neoliberal setup so as to have this regime you were talking about. Can you give us something concrete? Since I don't really understand, if the finance is about to flow out, how are we supposed to de-link and manage them?
Much of my life I've spent in a country which was de-linked. This country, I think I was telling you last time, when I went to Oxford, I had only £3 sterling. This country was de-linked from globalization. It had huge capital controls. It had huge foreign exchange controls. It had huge trade controls. So this is not something which is beyond our conception. We actually had a regime of that kind. But of course, I'm now suggesting that we don't just go back to that regime. On the contrary, we actually go on to a regime that may have the same kind of controls, but is associated through the institution of a welfare state, which is characterized by giving people or by legislating a set of fundamental economic rights. Yes.
So, actually, the last recommendations you have said about how we can overcome the neoliberal, or how we can get away from this foreign finance capital. Like, we are in a state called Kerala. We have a regime, like a pro-people regime here, and there is another regime in the union government. So the federal principles.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. In other words, all these I'm suggesting, raising 10% extra of, or raising government spending 10% more. We don't have one government. Much of this expenditure on healthcare, education, and so on would have to be done by the state government. The wealth tax revenue would come to the central government. So obviously it has to be worked out in terms of.
There is the problem that the indirect taxes are the main source of revenue for state governments.
Yes.
But we don't have access to these direct taxes, which is said to be progressive.
Yes, of course. I agree. I mean, in other words, of course, to the extent that you actually have a government at the center that is neoliberal, you as a state can't delink from neoliberalism.
Right.
And even if there is a central pro-neoliberal government, and even in the states, anti-neoliberal government, even in the states, anti-neoliberal government, the arrangements have to be made, and they're not very easy.
Somehow we have to be, we have to give our people the food, the things, So we need some kind of these FDIs and all, right? Because
no, I mean, look, you're not going to prevent FDI. After all, if somebody wishes to come and invest in Kerala, in that case, you are not saying no, we don't want you here. But because that actually would be against the law. But on the other hand, I don't think that you have no option other than simply going after FDI. Okay? I don't think so. I believe it was a mistake to have gone in for GST. Okay? Because that completely took away the autonomy of the state governments.
What about the massive capital expenditure the government is trying to make for the last couple of fiscal years? Even in Kerala, the KIFBI, the capital expenditure that has to be taken up by the KIFBI, it was linked to the London Stock Exchange, to the international finance market and all. How do you see it?
You see, the point is, firstly, the capital expenditure is not on a scale. I mean, the capital expenditure is very large, but the capital, I'm talking on the central government, I don't know about I have not looked at Kerala finances, but the capital expenditure itself may be large, but the government's overall expenditure is not necessarily rising at a rate that would get you to a higher growth trajectory. Okay. And in addition, a very substantial amount of this capital expenditure leaks out abroad. Okay. Its multiplier effects are not felt domestically. So that I think the capacity of this capital expenditure to stimulate the economy is limited for two reasons. Firstly, that this capital expenditure is not necessarily raising government's overall expenditures, but is at the expense of other expenditures. And secondly, it itself actually has very substantial leakages.
So one more thing, like nowadays there are protests have been taken place in Kenya against the finance bill which has been imposed by IMF, and in the last week itself Bolivia survived a coup. So there are many uprisings which have been taken all over the world. So how do you see that? What's the future of working class movements all over the world?
But you see, the very fact that there are these attempts at coup and so on is itself symptomatic of an emerging context of struggles. Last 20, 30 years, there were no coups. Okay, no significant coups. That is so. The point is that that I see the current context marked by the emergence of fascism on the one side, and of course the emergence of working class struggles on the other side, all over Europe, and even in the United States, but certainly all over Europe, there has been an upsurge of strike action by the workers. In Britain, for instance, the nurses went on a strike and so on, all over Europe. And to that extent, therefore, you find that the placidity which had set in at a political level under the neoliberal regime is being broken. Okay. So we are entering a period, I believe, of fairly intense class struggles.
Hello, sir. So I was just basically wanted to dwell more on that point of fiscal deficit contributing to leakages in the economy.
Leakages?
In terms of capital expenditures.
Oh, capital expenditure. That's not fiscal deficit. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So leakages in the economy primarily by imports.
Yeah,
right.
Sure. Yeah.
So that again has the tendency to depreciate the economy. So I remember seeing a funny WhatsApp forward comparing the PM's age and the value of the rupee in terms of dollars across the years, steadily declining. And that again has the effect of depressing real wages and employment. So it's kind of quite stuck.
Just have a look at the fact that we are having these large capital expenditure projects, but on the other hand, the capital goods producing sector in the Indian economy is not one that is showing any great dynamism. So that obviously, if so much is being spent on capital expenditures, on building infrastructure and so on, you would be expecting that the capital goods producing sector should be doing very well, but is not. So obviously a substantial amount of it is leaking out.
So in the Indian context, the corporate taxes have been reduced, but on the contrary, the private investments are also not taken up.
Actually, that is something which is going to worsen the crisis. Why? Suppose you reduce corporate taxes by 100 rupees. Because of the fact that you have got the fiscal responsibility legislation, you would actually be cutting down on expenditures elsewhere. Okay. Now, these 100 rupees that you have handed over to the corporates, they're not going to be spending. On the other hand, the 100 rupees that you have reduced your spending on basically means a shrinkage of aggregate demand.
See, before 1990, during budget times, we used to discuss about monetization of deficit. That discussion is not seen anywhere these days. In textbooks, in articles on fiscal situation, the discussion on monetization of deficit almost completely disappeared. So I would like to get your comments on this. That's question number one. There is another thing. You are speaking about, you are suggesting delinking as an option. But during COVID pandemic, there was a kind of delinking happening even without countries taking a conscious decision of delinking. World trade suffered, supply chains got broken, and as a result, some of the sectors started producing more, doing well. Agriculture in many countries for that matter. Now, because of the Suez crisis and all, again, you have a situation where now the supply chains are broken and movement of goods and services are a problem. As a result, the supply chains are getting restructured, and probably production is getting relocated in different parts of the world. So there is a possibility of a kind of imposed non-voluntary kind of delinking. In that case, some kind of restructuring of global production is possible.
Oh yes. In fact, I think in any case now, with the US sanctions against almost 35 countries, 40 countries, there is obviously a certain automatic delinking taking place. And these 35 countries are so large, many of them. Imagine sanctions against Russia. I mean, you actually had a situation where the expectation is that they're going to destroy the ruble. But on the contrary, the ruble did very well because the Russian government made one very important announcement. They said that they are now going to sell oil or natural gas, their thing is natural gas, against rubles. If so, then naturally the demand for rubles would rise. And the ruble actually did very well immediately after the sanctions had been imposed. But in any case, the imposition of sanctions, while it hurts the country immediately, because naturally you don't get medicines and so on. I think that is one very important I was on an international tribunal recently which looked at sanctions. We got evidence from a lot of countries which had been affected by sanctions. And one thing which was very common to all the sanctioned countries is the absence of medicines. And that was a very big kind of thing. And which basically means children and the elderly are the worst hits because of this. Worst hit because of sanctions. But obviously if you impose sanctions, then people are going to make alternative arrangements. And so a degree of delinking, I mean, this is the irony, a degree of delinking is being imposed upon the world by those who really would not like delinking to be there,
some of the African countries,
Yes.
They start nationalizing mines, and they decided that they are not going to supply to the Europe. And that's creating certain kind of movements.
Yes. I agree. In fact, as I was saying, I think this intensification of class struggle, one of the remarkable things, one of the fundamental difference between Indian independence and in Africa, West Africa in particular, is that French troops were there in every ex-colony. I mean, I was, when I first visited, I was quite amazed. In India, we had full independence, but none of the French colonies. And what is more, when this very well-known African leader, Thomas Sankara, tried to get the French out, there was a coup d'etat and he was killed. But now they are, some countries are progressively getting French troops out. So there is an upsurge that I see on the horizon taking place.
Monetization.
Yeah. You see, the point is that one of the things that used to happen in the old days is that the Reserve Bank of India was the, that all government borrowing that was not taken up by the market automatically devolved on the Reserve Bank of India. Okay. And the Reserve Bank would, over a period of time, start selling them. But immediately, as far as the government was concerned, the RBI was the agency that marketed government debt, and if something was not marketed, it actually had to bear that debt itself. I think that the change in that, I mean, that fundamentally made the entire monetary situation dependent upon the government's fiscal policy. But the change in that, which Manmohan Singh's government, when he was finance minister, that is, Narasimha Rao's government brought about, when neoliberalism, I think one of the features of neoliberalism was that the amount of government borrowing from the Reserve Bank was fixed, so that there's no question of the Reserve Bank picking up government bonds that were unsold in the market. And so that was something which actually meant that government debt could not be monetized at will. There was a magnitude of maximum that could be monetized. And that...
But, most of the developed countries, during their earlier stages of development, they have used monetization to finance.
Absolutely. In fact, the Radcliffe Committee report and so on, they basically argued that, that even those days, before all these credit cards and so on, that money supply is endogenous. The Radcliffe Committee report said that you fix the interest rate, that the central bank's role is to fix the interest rate. Okay. And this was before the whole business of limits on monetization was being imposed. You see, limits on monetization are really now not limits on money supply, they are limits on the government's fiscal policy. Yes.
In an exam, a student was asked the question, typically we are asked this question, what are the central problems in economics? So what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. Instead of that, a student has written, instead of what to produce, poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So she wanted to have an alternative view, which we need to be taking about. What do you think of such responses? Don't you think those are much more relevant than the other one?
Yes, of course, because I think the other one is basically the way that economics started, Adam Smith, Ricardo, and so on. But on the other hand, when they started, they were fighting the feudal order. And whole Adam Smith's fundamental objection was to the feudal order and the restrictions imposed on capital. His argument was that you remove these restrictions, this is an economy that will function very beautifully. And the terms they used, like natural rate of profit, natural rate of wages, and so on, suggested that the functioning of this economy would be in conformity with natural laws, and that these were being prevented from being kind of, from revealing themselves because of all kinds of restrictions. But on the other hand, we know that the functioning of capitalism, you see, even people like Adam Smith, they're completely unaware of the whole colonialism, imperialism, and so on. Adam Smith had a brilliant discussion of, he contrasts Bengal with the USA. Okay. He talks of, and Bengal had been a colony, so he contrasts Bengal as a declining economy with US as an emerging economy, putting the two on a par. And the reason he gives why Bengal is a declining economy and the US is an advancing economy is that the US is governed by the crown while Bengal is governed by a company. So the fact that East India Company ruled Bengal while the British Crown ruled United States is, according to him, the reason for the difference. But I mean, obviously, it shows a complete absence of any understanding. Maybe they were writing much too early, but maybe things were not clear at that time. But now, when we look at it, then obviously we cannot think in terms of economics simply doing what they did, or their successors along the same lines did. We have to now focus on unemployment, poverty, and all the rest of it. Your student seems to be a very good student.
That question might have come before getting disciplined in the discipline.
Please do not discourage your student from asking questions like that.
Sir,
Yeah, one last.
yesterday Professor Patnaik said that the demise of neoliberal policy will happen in India soon. Just like Professor commented. So what's your take on that? And also one question is that nowadays, due to that, peasant movements happened recently in India. So a strong movement happened in India. So this is a scenario she commented like that. And also nowadays in Indian scenario, the left is not that much, but strong to carry this kind of movement. So regional parties can, like SP in Uttar Pradesh, they can lead somehow in the present election also. So this kind of regional parties can lead this kind of present movements, can change it, this kind of neoliberal policies, kind of left.
Yes, the point is not some identifiable group of people whom we call left. In France, for instance, this new Popular Front, the strongest element of this new Popular Front is this Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is a former socialist. Not the Communist Party. Communist Party is very small now in France. It was very powerful during the war and post-war years. So we can't look at particular people as embodying the left. I mean, I think the left is that which actually carries forward a left agenda. Okay, it's perfectly possible that in many countries you would have a situation where the left, as originally identified, is not very powerful, but a left agenda can go forward. You can have new forces emerging. In Latin America, for instance, all these left upsurge that is taking place in many countries, or in Africa, all these changes which are in West Africa, they're not being led by forces which 20 years ago you'd have identified as left. Okay, so I think we should move away from that. But when it comes to a left agenda, I believe that is something which is very much not only arising, but something which is actually gaining ground all over the world, including in India. I think the peasant movement in India was really, for reasons we have been discussing last 3 days, that neoliberalism is one that affects petty producers, particularly peasant agriculture, and the peasantry has suffered. I mean, for instance, this whole spate of suicides of peasants is an extreme manifestation of that suffering. But on the other hand, there is just no doubt at all about the lowering of the standards of living of the agricultural population. I was saying, I don't know if Utsa has already said it, in 2017-18 you found, relative to 2011-12, the per capita, not even real income, real expenditure in rural India was 9% lower in these. So obviously there has been an extraordinary squeeze as far as the peasant agriculture, petty production sector is concerned. And of course, if the peasantry is being squeezed, they squeeze the laborers. So it's not. So all this, I believe, is also creating a reaction in terms of an upsurge of class struggle, which is sought to be suppressed by the Hindu, Muslim, and all this Hindutva agenda and so on. Okay, the whole idea is to combat it and to carry the class struggle forward.
Thank you. I think we can. Thank you. Actually, we are moving